I'm breaking rocks in the hot sun. I fought the law and the law won. I fought the law and the law won.
Hi, I'm Robert Young Pelton, and part of this podcast series for the world's most dangerous places is to help people understand things and concepts that maybe you don't normally talk about in the scheme of things in terms of like international travel and even domestic turmoil. But one of the things that I'm fascinated with is the concept of law and order. And I spend most of my time with the opposite of that, you know, being smuggled into countries or dealing with criminal groups or gangs or terrorists. But I think it's critical to understand law and order and how it works and how it doesn't work and how we should embrace it, because it is the foundation of civilization. Laws are what basically separates us from the jungle, if you want to call it that. So I want you to meet a guy named Artie McConnell. And Artie is a very interesting guy. He's, you know, to get on this show, you have to have worked in dangerous places. And so he qualifies very well. He spent 10 years on the mean streets in New York, and he spent another decade prosecuting criminals, and not just any criminal, but rather complex crimes. And I'll let him explain, but I just want to welcome him. And Artie, welcome to the world's most dangerous places.
It's great to see you again, sir.
Well, we're going to start with something that's embarrassing for you. Is I remember when we first met, you told me that you had worked the boroughs, you know, like the mean streets. And I said, oh, you must love the 7-Ups and the French Connection. Like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. So I thought that was kind of funny that you came from exactly that place, but you hadn't seen the cool fake movies about those places.
I have not. I was born in the 70s, but those movies were not part of my my childhood, and I have no idea what you're talking about to this day.
So what was the impetus as a young man to get into law and to get into law enforcement?
You know, it's a really good question. I was not a good student in, you know, elementary school, high school. I went to college mostly because I wanted to continue playing soccer. And in college, I got really interested in two apparently different areas. The first was geopolitics and international relations. I was fascinated by particularly Russian history, what was going on in former Soviet Central Asia and Afghanistan at the time. You were over there, so I don't have to tell you what was happening, but I was just fascinated by what a lot of scholars and academics were calling the new great game that was playing out in the heart of Asia. And the other thing that I really gravitated towards was political philosophy and constitutional law. I was really, really interested with how particularly criminal procedure laws in the United States developed through the process of common law and, you know, just how things were shaped in court. That, you know, we had our rules, we had our Constitution, but they really were in practice subject to, you know, case by case application. And
I want to interrupt you there because just if people don't know, you're talking about the Reagan era and the lead up to that. In 1979, Carter and Brzezinski signed the first secret order to start helping the Mujahideen, you know, fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. And then when Reagan came into office, he cooked up a number of conflicts and supported other conflicts that you could argue about their legality. Most were illegal, but whether it was Angola, Laos, the Iran, I'm sorry, not Iran-Contra, but I mean the Nicaraguan Contra. These were quasi-legal activities that were sort of taped over with sort of presidential findings and things like that. Did you ever find yourself wondering, like, how can you run these covert wars and still meet the rule of law?
Not really. I think that, you know, when you're talking about international politics and covert operations and intelligence gathering, that's very different from, I think, what we consider the rule of law domestically. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later on when you're doing complex international investigations. Like, how do you square that? How do you make sure that the constitutional principles that law enforcement are required to follow
versus gangsters?
Versus gangsters and weapons traffickers and spies, and how does that square? But I was much more interested in sort of the power politics, the changing relationships between the United States and other regional powers. I thought what was going on in Afghanistan was fascinating, where, as you know, it was really just a cauldron for jihadis all over the world to come and to train and to export that brand of activism, let's call it, all over the world.
Yeah, New Yorker, we pumped $3 billion, and the Saudis pumped $3 billion into probably the most psycho people that you'd ever want to meet. So yes, we got some payback, and of course, Bin Laden was managing a lot of the money out of an office in Peshawar for the Arab-speaking jihadis at that time, which I don't know if people knew at the time, but they used to come over to the States and raise money in the mosques and everything. So it was like a good thing back then that we were fighting the Soviets. But I mean, that's an interesting time in history, because under Reagan, we were sort of fighting for freedom, right? That was the sense of backing all these different groups.
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming at it a little later. I was more post-Soviet collapse, when the Taliban and the Northern Alliance were still duking it out for control over much of the country. And again, coming at it from sort of a post-Soviet Russian studies perspective, I was fascinated by how, you saw issues of Islamic extremism popping up in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and how it was sort of radiating outward from there.
Well, let's go backwards a bit. So when you were a prosecutor, just give me a sketch of what your focus was and what your area of expertise was.
Yeah, so I mean, that was what I was really interested in college. I mean, my graduation present to myself was I promptly left graduation and went over to the stands for about 2 months. And I
What year was this?
2000.
Okay. Good timing.
Yeah, it was pretty good timing. And it was great. It was just fascinating. As you know, you learn so much more from actually being in a place than you can from just reading about them or watching the news. And I fully intended on going to law school and taking some job in foreign affairs or intelligence, or doing some sort of strategic analysis, particularly of that part of the world.
If the readers don't know what the stands were like in 2000, possibly maybe the most lawless place on earth.
It wasn't so bad. I guess it depends. It depends. I mean, for you to say that means a lot, but it was very lawless. The Tajik civil war had sort of cooled down, but it was still a very, very rough part of the world. There was a lot of corruption. Mm-hmm. There was just a tremendous amount of instability, and regional warlords were definitely calling the shots in parts of the region, to be sure.
Yeah, it was a criminal nation. I mean, Russia was sitting on tons and tons of weapons, and all the companies were being sold off to carpetbaggers. And Tajikistan, particularly the criminal gangs in Tajikistan, were more powerful than the government.
Well, it depends who you ask, right? But it was an interesting time in history. And I thought it was just a fascinating part of the world and something that I wanted to stay involved in. But the other real passion that I had when I was a student was, trial advocacy. I loved it. I loved, doing mock trials. I loved the fact patterns that they would give us. I would spend hours, trying to become an expert in ballistics or asphyxial death or all of these things to try and, figure out the problem. And I was good at it, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
I got when I was looking for a job, I got an interview at the Manhattan District Attorney's office. The district attorney that at that time was a gentleman by the name of Robert Morgenthau, who's, he was there for a long time, very famous. He had fought in World War II. He was the impetus for all the TV shows that I watch now, not the old ones that you're talking about, but the ones that I watch.
You keep saying old ones. You can still watch them on TV. Come on.
But, I went there and I had my interview with him, and, the office, it just looked like the set of a TV show. It really did. And here's this very distinguished man looking at my resume, asking me like, well, what's all this Russia stuff? Like, what are you doing over in Central Asia? Just looking at it, I'm not really sure how this interview's going. And he looks at me and he says, I don't think you'll be here for longer than your 3-year commitment, but you'll do a good job. That's an offer. And I was ecstatic. And I figured, I'll go to New York. I'll do this cool job. I'll try a couple of cases. And then after my commitment's up in 3 years, I'll go back to doing, my former Soviet Central Asia foreign policy stuff. And of course, I was there for 10 years. And I loved every second of it. There was really nothing more exciting, frankly, than to be a young prosecutor and be out on what's called homicide call, where literally you get a phone call in the middle of the night from whatever, detective squad has just picked up the latest shooting or body in New York. And they say, get up here. And that's something that's different in New York. Not every jurisdiction works like that, but the prosecutors work very closely with detectives on major crimes from the outset. And the reason is that there are critical legal decisions that can be made early on in an investigation that can blow up on you in a courtroom 3 years later. And so if you're not sort of anticipating those things, you're really shortchanging the case. And so on any homicide or any non-fatal shooting that was deemed to be serious, we would go out on call and be very much part of the investigation. And to, again,
how would you characterize New York at the time? Lawless, lawful, under control?
It was better. It was much better. The crack epidemic had sort of subsided. I mean, Manhattan was no longer clocking 500 murders a year, which it had been. And there was sort of the Disneyfication of Times Square had taken place, and these neighborhoods were gentrifying. But it was shocking to me how much the underworld still exists all around us. And I mean, New York is just an incredibly diverse city, and you've got literally, bad guys from all stripes doing all different things all over the place.
Help me out, because we grew up with the idea that it's Italian mobsters replaced by the Jewish mobsters, replaced by the Haitians or whatever. What's the reality in terms of who runs what in New York with gangs or mobs?
I think if you find somebody who can answer that question, they're probably lying to you. I mean, that's part of what makes it such a challenge, is because things are so fluid and things are so dynamic. And one of the things that changed while I was there, like the rest of the world, is it became more globalized. You had all of these synergies between criminal groups that would, not have interacted maybe beforehand. The traditional Italian organized crime was still present. They're still present right now, but you did have ascendancies of other ethnic-based organized crime groups, whether the Russians or the Chinese triads, the Albanians. Everybody had their piece, and they sort of followed their immigrant community wherever those were set up throughout the city. And we would see coordination with more, local type street gangs who were involved in in narcotics and extortion and other types of things. So it really depended what block you were on, to be honest with you, or what housing project you were talking about, or what part of the city you were in. And I think there was a realization that too much violence was bad for business. And so if somebody was going to get hurt, there was probably a reason. The shoot 'em up stuff that you saw during the crack epidemic that really highlighted the street level drug trade and, those kinds of, street level drug trafficking organizations, that subsided a little bit. Things moved indoors. That's not to say there wasn't, violence, but it wasn't, if you weren't in the game, so to speak, you were not going to be privy to that in the way that you might have been in the late 80s or 90s.
So would it be fair to say that these were businesses, and in order for those businesses to exist, there had to be some either looking the other way, or how would you characterize the relationship between the political system at that time and the criminal activity? Were they in separate worlds, or were they intertwined?
I mean, there's going to be some overlap when you're talking about some of the new ventures that, let's say, criminal organizations would get involved in. I mean, we saw very, very sophisticated, tax refund schemes involving, smuggled gasoline, identity theft. The whole rise of the digital economy was capitalized on first by the underworld before sort of the rest of us got on the train. And were there overlaps with legitimate business? Yeah, a little bit. I would say that legitimate businesses were exploited more. Now, when you go outside of the country, that's where you see a real blurring of sort of the black market and legitimate business. And
legalization of crime, I guess, would be a way to put it.
Yeah.
Things like money laundering and bribery are not necessarily, it's called patronage and investments. So did you feel like in the 10 years that you worked the streets, did you chip away at it? Or what was your sense that you were dealing with it? Or
I really do. And maybe that's because I want to feel like I didn't waste my time. But I'll tell you, when we did a major conspiracy investigation into a crew that was controlling a housing project, I mean, people were very thankful. And when you can take out a very high ranking, influential figure from one of these groups, or even when you can just solve a murder in a neighborhood where the culture is not to talk to the police and, don't call 911 and, snitches get stitches is a real thing. When you can penetrate that kind of culture and have a successful prosecution, I really do believe it has a deterrent effect. I think it shows people in some of these communities that the gangs are not in charge. I think it shows sort of the rest of the city that we're doing our job. And so, yeah, I do. I believe that, that sort of thing has an impact, even though it may be difficult to measure.
Well, what do you think of the celebritification of people like Rudy Giuliani, who makes a big thing about cleaning up the city? Is that a real thing, or is that just a political stance?
I mean, I have no politicians say that.
You don't have to comment. I'm just saying that a lot of times people run on the law and order thing, meaning that somehow there's going to be more law and more order.
I think that's a real thing, and I think that particularly in New York, the mayor and the 5 district attorneys throughout the city really can set the tone for law and order. And if you think about it, in some ways, every prosecution is a discretionary one, right? The police have to make a decision. Am I going to put the handcuffs on this guy for whatever he did or not? And then when the district attorney is evaluating that case, they need to think, well, are we going to charge this person? What are we going to charge them with? Do we make them an offer? Do we think this is like a case that deserves jail? So there are all of these factors that go into it, and the tone for that is really set at the top, which is why elections matter and the politics matter, because the police department on one side and the prosecutors on the other side, that's where they get their direction from. So I think it makes a difference. Yeah.
So what's the flag you fly? Is it the conviction rate? Is that the thing that you look at to say I did my job?
No, and particularly in Manhattan, where I was for 10 years, that was absolutely not. No one ever cared about conviction rate. No one cared I don't want to say no one cared. Of course, as a prosecutor, you should not be bringing a case unless you believe that the person's guilty and you can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you can't, then you have no business charging that case or being in court with that case. But look, you're going to lose cases as a prosecutor if you're doing your job. And I mean, you're going to lose cases that matter. You're going to lose murder cases. You're going to lose sex crimes cases. And that is not the metric to judge whether or not you're being successful.
Let's talk about like the Roy Cohn mystique. Like there's some super lawyers that can get anybody out of jail or off the hook. Is that a mythology or is that true?
I think it's a mythology in that there are super lawyers who can get anybody off of anything. I mean, there are good and bad lawyers, just like there are good and bad anything else. Pick the job. What I'll say is that a aggressive, ethical, competent defense bar is absolutely essential in order for the system to function. And now that I'm in, private practice, I'm living that. But you have your rock star defense attorneys. Some are the ones that are not getting the headlines. There are some outstanding defense lawyers whose names you would never know, but they're some of the most effective in the city because of their experience, and they don't crave the limelight, and they know how to represent their clients effectively. So are there like superstars who can swoop in and do magic? No, they're not. But I will say that one of the things that makes New York such a special place to practice law is we have such an experienced and aggressive defense bar. Like I said, I can't overstate how necessary that is to keep the government honest. And it was never something that I was upset about. Like when I was a prosecutor, I wanted to go up against the best. Mm-hmm. And it makes you better as a lawyer. It makes you rethink your case constantly, which is always a good thing. You should always be reevaluating things for changed circumstances. You never want to get locked into a position because that's when mistakes happen. So I was always very fortunate to be dealing with, I think, the cream of the crop with the defense bar. And it was always something that was a good experience, win or lose.
So how do judges figure into the mix? You've got one side prosecuting, you got the other side defending, and then you have judges. How should we view judges in a place like New York? Do you have good judges, bad judges? Are they all good judges?
It's like anything else, right? There's good, bad, and everybody in between. I mean, the role judges play is absolutely essential. And I do want to just clear up one thing. It's not just prosecutors on one side and defense attorneys on the other side. Defense attorney has an absolute obligation to represent their client's interests as zealously as possible. That's their job. Prosecutor has really two jobs. They have to represent the interests of their client, which is the district attorney or the federal government, whoever it is. But prosecutors have a very important gatekeeping function, which is, I was alluding to that before, where you have a tremendous amount of power to decide, do we charge someone? What do we charge them with? Is this a felony? Is it a misdemeanor? Do I present this case to the grand jury? And then once someone's charged, what do we do with that case? Do we make them an offer? Should they go? Should we offer them probation? Should we seek jail? So there's a gatekeeping role for the prosecutor that is sort of separate and apart of the adversarial system. Now,
is there a pressure to settle things, or how do you determine whether you're going to settle something or go all the way?
Well, look, in the perfect world, you evaluate every case on its individual merits. Mm-hmm. you have to have very open dialogue with the defense attorney because they're going to tell you things that you don't know. They're going to tell you things about the client that are not going to be apparent from a police report or a rap sheet. And so you have to listen and really make up your own mind. And part of what makes a good prosecutor's office and what was so special about Manhattan when I was there was very collaborative. So we would have meetings where we would talk about cases and what the right thing to do was. And that was always the touchstone, right? Like, what's the right thing to do in this case? Should this person really go to jail for this? Or is this a situation where they deserve a second chance? And maybe if they do probation, maybe we dismiss the case. There were situations where it was like, no, this is a horrible crime, terrible. We've got multiple victims here. We're never going to recover, and we're gonna go for the max. But it's a very situation specific analysis.
So what about the idea that the wealthy are treated differently? They get off, they're less to be charged because they donate. And I mean, this is a perception. It's not real, but is that a real thing? I mean,
anyone with more resources is going to be able to use those resources to their advantage, whether that's, hiring a team of defense lawyers who are the best in the business. Does that stuff figure into charging decisions? It's certainly not supposed to. What I can tell you is both when I was an ADA in Manhattan and then later as a federal prosecutor in Brooklyn, political corruption cases were very sought after because they generated a lot of press. In addition to all the other reasons why we should be pursuing corruption. But, I never felt like, oh, well, this person's from this political party, we're not going to go after them. If it was a big name person in a position of power and there was an allegation that there was something corrupt or illegal going on, we were given that a very close look. Nobody ever told me you can't investigate this person. Now, is that different in other parts of the country? I can't speak to that. I can only tell you from where I was sitting.
So the last thing is on your prosecutor side, on the Manhattan stuff, were you always surprised by juries, or are they manageable, predictable? How does that work out?
It's funny because when I go to other places around the world where they don't have the jury system, they're blown away that we do this. I think that juries generally do the right thing. That's not to say that I wasn't like horribly disappointed when I lost a case, but I would rather trust a group of 12 people from the community who don't know each other to get together, deliberate, and do the right thing based on the facts and the law than I would, anything else.
So that's the bedrock of our system.
I really believe that it is. I really do believe that it is. It's something where, I've had cases like everybody understands murder, right? Everybody understands robbery. Those are easy. But when you have to educate a juror about securities law or about, digital advertising fraud or very complex, medical things that happen to a human body when they're in their last moments of life and the evidentiary significance of that. Yeah, the reaction is like, well, how are these folks, some of whom may be teachers, some of whom may be, mechanics or have some blue collar job. They didn't graduate high school. English is a second language for some of them. I mean, it's Manhattan, we see everybody, but somehow they all get it. They really do. And part of the challenge, both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, is to understand your jury and make the case digestible to them. And I would say more often than not, they get it right. They really do.
So we need to keep the faith in, is what you're saying.
I would. I've seen no reason not to. I mean, that's not to say you hear about cases, the jury acquitted or they convicted. How could they possibly do that? Nobody knows what goes on during a trial other than the jury. And so when people tell me, how did this happen? You gotta trust the people who were there. The jury's there. They're listening to every word of testimony. They see every piece of evidence. They can get it read back to them. They can examine it in the jury room. They can deliberate for as long as they want. They can ask the judge to, re-instruct them on the law, which is very, very important. The legal particulars of whatever crime is being charged really do matter. So you can have something that appears to be horrible on its face, but it may not meet the particular elements of the crime that was charged. Mm-hmm. So let's not say this is a good person or a bad person or something, that happened isn't a travesty and awful, but it's got to meet the elements of the crime charged. And jurors, again, in my experience, they take great care applying the facts to the law. And that's something that's not really always apparent to maybe you or me when we're reading about something in the paper or hearing about it in a 30-second clip on the news or on the radio or something.
So you worked at this job diligently. You put all the bad guys in jail, and then they said, we got another mission for you, right? And you shifted. So tell me about your next career move and some of the challenges that were facing you when you took this decision.
Yeah. So look, I was doing mostly homicides and sex crimes. It was emotionally draining. It really is. I mean, that stuff wears on you. You see stuff that you can't forget. And I think I was ready for a bit of a change. And the last year that I was at the Manhattan DA's office, I was in something called the Major Economic Crimes Bureau. And one thing that's unique about Manhattan being sort of in the center of not only New York City, but, the World Financial Center, is we would do cases that would span all over the world. Manhattan is notorious for viewing its jurisdiction very broadly. And one of the ways that they do that is any wire transaction that passes through New York City would arguably give the district attorney of Manhattan jurisdiction over the predicate offense there. So you could have stuff going on in, Iran, oil smuggling, and if they're laundering money in dollars and those dollars are being cleared through a bank in New York, and this really happened. I mean, we got multi-billion-dollar settlements against banks for laundering Iranian money. We would prosecute those cases. Those are typically cases that the federal government prosecutes. When I started doing those, I really enjoyed it. It really brought me back to my days, doing international relations and geopolitics and getting back into the world of national security. And I applied for a job as an assistant United States attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn, which had a very, very, and still does, has a very, very renowned national security practice. And I was very fortunate to get a job there.
Just to explain to people listening, why Brooklyn and why national security? How do they link?
Well, I was living in Brooklyn at the time, but Brooklyn.
Airports, right? Are you talking about what jurisdiction do they have over?
Well, yeah, they have JFK and they have LaGuardia. They've got ports and things like that, which obviously make them, those are targets for terrorism. Let's be honest, but it's more than that. And like I said, New York, both the Southern District in Manhattan and the Eastern District in Brooklyn, really view their jurisdiction as worldwide. Our investigations take us all over the world, and so when I say national security matters, I'm talking about both foreign and domestic terrorism, counterintelligence and espionage cases. Counterproliferation cases where you have, weapons traffickers and smugglers trying to get their hands on very, very sophisticated and highly controlled U.S. technology that can be, put in hypersonic missiles or undersea drones or, all sorts of other stuff. And it's a
But people don't understand and it bothers some of our allies like China and Russia that we say we have jurisdiction over their economic decisions, right? But what made New York decide that it was going to be a globocop? Was there some particular moment in history that they extended their reach to the entire world?
I think it's something that's always been that way. The Southern District of New York, again in Manhattan, not the office where I work, they were affectionately called the Sovereign District of New York, which just meant that they could, initiate cases and investigations all over the world. But in Brooklyn, we did the same thing. There's a few other offices around the country that really have developed this extraterritorial, transnational flavor to their cases. And I don't view it as being globocop, to be honest. I view it as absolutely essential to protecting U.S. interests abroad in many ways. I mean, if we want to be the country that is first to develop, the quantum computer, then the stuff that we're making over here, we should have some degree of control over where it goes and how it's disseminated in other parts of the world. If you're telling me that terrorists who train in Afghanistan and Syria can end up on a subway in New York City, well, then I care about what's going on in those places if I'm the prosecutor there. So
I used to tell people that I met more members of Al Qaeda taking the taxi from JFK to downtown New York, and they didn't believe me. But yeah, they trained in the camps and they drive a cab now. So that's interesting because you don't see a lot of Chinese gumshoes knocking on people's doors in the States, right? That's more of an intelligence action.
It is. I would say that the primacy of the U.S. dollar is really a big part of why the United States is able to exercise jurisdiction so broadly.
And sanctions, right? I mean, that's really what it's about, is sanctions.
It is, but again, those U.S. dollar payments still clear through U.S. banks, and so that is a jurisdictional hook that we use to prosecute what's otherwise entirely overseas conduct. I'll give you one example. It's a corporate case, and I should tell you, we don't just we didn't just go after people. We went after corporations as well, which is something I don't think the public really understands. The Justice Department has a very, very important role. I don't want to say they're like a super regulator, but they are in some ways in investigating corporate malfeasance on a systemic level within the company. This is one of the big criticisms, after the financial crisis. It's like, well, why aren't any of these companies being held accountable? Well, they should. But we had a case where a French company was operating a cement plant in Syria and paying off the local ISIS warlords in order to keep it running.
Is that Lafarge?
Yeah, Lafarge. That's right. Yeah.
My friend did a documentary on that because somebody did a big drop about French intelligence paying them.
Is that right?
Paying protection to ISIS. Yeah.
Yeah, well, look, and again, they're not paying ISIS because they, believe in the mission. They're paying it so they can operate their business, but they were coming under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Attorney in Brooklyn because of U.S. dollar payments, because some of the electronic communications were passing through servers in New York, and they were charged for providing material support to a terrorist organization. I think paid out something in the neighborhood of $1 billion. So
let me ask you, so in the old days, you get a call like we got a dead body in the back alley, and then you go there and you deal with it. How does it work when you're doing international investigations?
Well, it's a real critical difference there. So the first is very reactive, right? Somebody's been shot. We need to figure out who did it and hold them accountable. If we can do it, they're arrested. We go to trial. That person's either convicted or found not guilty. These types of cases in the national security space are necessarily proactive. There's rarely sort of a thing that happens. Now, that's not always the case. We had terrorist attacks in New York where we were in reactive mode. But most of the cases were sort of proactive, where we were trying to address a particular threat stream or area of concern. And you build towards it, and you don't know where you're going to end up necessarily. And you don't even know if you're going to be able to prosecute a case. One of the more, I won't say it's frustrating, but one of the different things about doing national security cases as a prosecutor is some of your best work may never actually result in a criminal case. You're rubbing elbows with the intelligence community. There are a lot of different equities at play, and you may never be in a position to actually bring charges and have the public know what you've been working on for the last 3 years. Or there's situations where you are working towards neutralizing a potential bad actor like a terrorist or something who's operating in the district. And how do you know that you stopped a terrorist attack? You don't. So it's a very different kind of investigation and prosecutorial mentality for sure.
How do you fight over who gets what? I mean, you've got all kinds of federal agencies that are chasing bad guys, for lack of a better word. They could be money launderers, could be part of a large network of hawallas and whatever. How do you figure out who goes after what?
It's not always so easy, right? And a lot of times there's jurisdictional fights between different U.S. attorneys' offices. I mean, we would get into it with the Southern District of New York all the time about who takes them. We would have joint jurisdiction over anything, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody plans something in Brooklyn, carries it out in Manhattan, both offices can prosecute something like that. Right. So it was not always easy. And, the agencies, there's I don't know, there's at least 24 agencies on the Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York, and they all have a lot of overlapping responsibilities. So it's a very, very difficult dance, and it's one that often had to be refereed by fairly high-level government people to say, you're out, you're in, this is your case, you take it. And sometimes it was, thanks for working on this for 2 years, we're not prosecuting this, we're going to go give it to somebody else. And sometimes we would give it to a foreign partner. We'd be investigating something that was going on overseas, and we'd say, well, you know what, let the Estonians prosecute this, or the Germans are best positioned to take care of this. The Spain has the most equity in this case, and they want it, so we're gonna let them have this one. We're gonna be in a support capacity. So that's a very complicated question that you asked.
All right, so you get this case that somebody puts it in your lap. I'm sure it's at least 5 or 6 binders full of evidence or whatever. How do you budget these things? Like, how do you even start figuring out what you're going to have to spend?
That's another really good question. So number one, again, the tone comes from the top, right? So part of the Justice Department has its priorities. One of the things that I was doing in my last 3 years in the office was I was in charge of, the National Security and Cybercrime section, specifically the Sanctions and Export Control Program. And that was a big priority. But, a Cuba sanctions case is not going to get as much attention as a Russia sanctions case when we're talking about, semiconductors being diverted and put into surveillance equipment that's being used in Ukraine. So you have to evaluate each potential case opportunity because resources are limited.
And I'm assuming you're working on more than one case at a time. How do you prioritize your case? Who tells you which one to spend more time on?
Things get hot and things get cold. I mean, it's literally that simple. I mean, there were situations where the case that we had been pushing forward for months would suddenly become stagnant, and something that we had not been paying too much attention to had suddenly become reinvigorated. We'd get a call from a foreign partner overseas, and they'd have a tip that, we've got a crate full of very sensitive dual-use electronics that we think are coming our way, and they're connected to a guy that we had a conversation with you about a few months ago, and you have to spin up. So you immediately have to be able to put one thing down and pick something else up, all while keeping a sort of a broad strategic hold on all of these things.
Right. Well, so one of the biggest, I guess, most visible elements of law enforcement is going after bad guys, and particularly with New York, with Bin Laden and people like that. And my first introduction to New York was when they have their own terrorism division after 9/11. They were the only people that called me because of my expertise in Afghanistan.
Good.
And I said, yeah, I was just down the road from Bin Laden like 4 years ago. And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, everybody knows where he is. And they're like, how do you know this? It was because you go on the ground and they go, yeah, he used to live here. He went over there and whatever. And it's always mystified me, whether it's Assata Shakur in Cuba or whether it's Joseph Kony in Car or whatever, how much energy is expended and how much money is expended to go after people. But yet, when you actually find them and you notify law enforcement, they just have no way to get that person back to any place where there's jurisdiction. So is it a myth to chase people around the world and think we're going to find them?
I mean, I don't think so. I think that there are obvious challenges to that. And, part of what we were talking about before is we are constrained in what we can do by the rules that we need to follow. So I can't just and this was, as you know, and as somebody who's been in dangerous places for work and for pleasure, just for tourism, you stand out a lot more when you're there in an official.
With the pygmies, trust me, they can't.
Oh yeah, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. But you know what I'm saying. I mean, if you're in an armored convoy going somewhere, nobody's going to talk to you. Now you can get a lot more information sitting on a carpet, having a few cups of tea with somebody than you can from all of the Zoom conferences with government officials. So it's a bit of a different type of dance, but.
Well, my question was, I specifically tracked down Bin Laden like twice. I specifically tracked down Kony 4 or 5 times a year. And when I bring this in, and also Assata Shakur, there's her house and here's where she shops and all this kind of stuff. When you bring this information to law enforcement, what they say is basically, we can't touch that. We have no assets. We have no way to get there. We have no transportation. But they always are very careful that you can't break any laws. You can't do this. You can't do that. And I'm like, you set up a goal that's impossible, right? You really cannot find, and these people know this, by the way. They use the local protection, right? And I keep telling people, you're going to find these people living in a nice house, protected by the local mayor, protected by the local governor. They're probably in some very lucrative smuggling business, which they usually are. So it's almost like I see two worlds in which we're spending hundreds of millions chasing people, and then these people make hundreds of millions while they're being chased. And will there be a day where we simply go out and grab somebody? And I know we have. We shot Bin Laden. We've brought in lots of people either through rendition or local partners, in Somalia and places like that. But are we successful in getting the bad guys, or is that also a myth?
No, I think that we are. And I think that, you're thinking about it from a particular perspective. If you think about it from the position of the U.S. government, what you're talking about is a very serious imposition on another country's sovereignty.
Right.
And that's why there are extradition treaties and mutual legal assistance treaties and all of these rules, is because you can't just go and look. Has it happened like with Bin Laden? Sure. But the extradition process is very, very complicated, and it should be. That's not the only way that we do get international fugitives and make arrests. And we can talk about Interpol and sort of their role, but just from a bilateral, country to country perspective, if there's someone in a country that we want and we have an arrest warrant for them, we will engage that country aggressively and we'll try and make something happen. And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. And sometimes the courts are the ones that will not grant extradition. We have plenty of situations where we've done very sophisticated operations on short timetables. I'm talking, 24, 48 hours in other parts of the world, just because we get a tip that somebody may be coming into a particular airport, and, we have a relationship with that government, and we have an arrest warrant, and we'll go through all kinds of hoops to make the arrest, and then the extradition won't be granted for some reason. And extradition proceedings can take years.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about our current war with cartels and things like that, sort of unnamed groups that are identified, secretly, but yet have some kind of presidential finding or some kind of serious thing against them. And I know when we get serious, we can do things like the FARC leadership. We're all wiped out in a very short period of time. I just wonder whether we have the tools to go out and get people, or like you say, we have to go through the rule of law, right? We can't just kidnap
I don't
them.
think it's a question of tools. I mean, number one, it's as you know, it is harder to locate and track people when you're sitting at a desk in New York, right? I mean, for all of the electronic surveillance that we're capable of, I would much rather have a good human source on the ground any day of the week, for sure. Right. No question about it. And that's always, a concern is, do we have the proper, human sources to act? And that's not always the case. But once you've identified, a person that you want to arrest and extradite, and they're located abroad, it's very country specific. Personalities matter. If we, the United States, send some bombastic guy over there to do these very sensitive negotiations, it's not going to go over very well.
I'm also thinking of like Assad Shakur. If people don't remember, the Black Panther who shot a New Jersey cop and skedaddled to Cuba and lived in perfect peace until she died of old age a few weeks ago, right? And it wasn't like it was a mystery that she was there. It wasn't like, I think she had another person with her, but I remember talking to the people that really wanted her and how hard it was. They couldn't just go to Cuba and arrest her, right? And the most they were willing to do was to have a Coast Guard ship that was just happened to be accidentally on, offshore. And it was very interesting what they couldn't do and what they could do. Well,
it's interesting you say that, because there are things called lure operations where you will try and coax someone out of their safe haven to a place where we can effect an arrest. And sometimes countries will, under diplomatic pressure or as part of a trade, expel people into U.S. custody. We have done prisoner swaps. I had a defendant who was part of, the largest prisoner swap with Russia since the end of the Cold War. The key person who was traded in that was a Wall Street Journal reporter. But there's
buddy Roger Carson was involved in that. Roger and I have been friends for years. But like you say, the government's actually good at this. The government is actually good at either stings, impersonation, or getting inside an organization and then blowing it up. It's just that it takes forever, right? It isn't media friendly when you get somebody like 2 or 3 years later.
I mean, we would do investigations that would last years, and I mean there are investigations that I was part of that were nowhere near conclusion on very, very sensitive subjects, and that's just the way it is. I mean, there's no quick fixes in the world of international security cases.
So again, do you feel comfortable that we're doing the right thing, that we have the right assets, we have the right tools to do these things, or do you feel like we need to spend a little bit more time understanding what we're up against? International criminals.
You can always spend more time understanding what you're up against, and I think the challenge that the current Justice Department is going to have with some of these international cases now is making sure that other countries are comfortable cooperating with us. When we provide information to another country, or when they provide it to us, it's often highly sensitive, and there has to be just a level of trust that information is going to be used appropriately, not disseminated widely. And when that's not the case, it blows up the relationship, and it can take years and years and years to repair. And that's why when I was, doing these cases, I would put such a premium on going to these places. Because like, as you know, you can get more done and form more of a bond, on a carpet with a cup of tea, or at a bar with a beer, or at dinner with a bottle of vodka than you can, over Zoom or in a boardroom, or, sending diplomatic cables back and forth. And that personal connection, I found, was one of the greatest case accelerators. And I think it's one that we can't ever shortchange. We need to have good, culturally sensitive, smart people at embassies around the world interacting with our partners in order to make these cases happen. Because they're not going to get any easier. They're only getting more and more complex.
Well, so for example, Russia today under Putin, if you found like a Jan Marsalek, remember the wired car guy, let's say you wanted him bad. Do you think you could go to Russia and say, can I have that guy, please? Or would they arrest you and put you in jail these days?
Probably not. No, but I think that's just unfortunately the nature of the diplomatic relationship right now.
But do you think that countries are weaponizing criminals these days? Because it's my experience that people that run criminal organizations, whether they run drugs or crypto or whatever, are very valuable to countries' intelligence agencies, whether it be Israel or the UAE.
Absolutely right. That's absolutely true. They are extremely valuable. And, I guess all I would say is that,
we don't have a plan for that. And what I'm saying, when a nation goes criminal,
I don't know that you can have a plan for it, honestly. I don't know that you can have a plan for it.
Well, I'm thinking the last time we got was Iran-Contra was really the last time that we looked at illegal operations as part of normal, current events and said, you shouldn't be doing that. Like you need to go to Congress, you need to do this. And yes, it's quicker to do that. Yes, it's faster, but ultimately it's illegal and it's degrading of the legal system. I see us returning to that, almost like a Far Eastern company structure where you let businessmen do things to private individuals, and then if it benefits the government, that's great. But if it benefits them, that's great too. So it's a loosening of the sense of law and order. Do you sense that?
I mean, I'm not in that world. This is the divide between sort of intelligence and law enforcement, and my experience is in the law enforcement space, and that's not something that we would even breaking the rules is not an option.
And that's something that we should really touch on. We see, or we think, when I say we, I mean the unwashed masses who don't have access to the boardroom. We think that there's some kind of deal or plan between criminal organizations and governments and intelligence. And of course, most of this is mythology, but we see like the Robert Maxwells of the world, right? And the Jeffrey Epsteins and things like that. And it paints a picture of another rule, like whether it's the Godfather movie or whatever, we just think there's another world in which it isn't black and white. It isn't law and order, that, they do work with certain agencies and groups to get things done, and that we don't see that. Now, is that completely mythology or is that true?
Again, not my area. I can tell you that you're not going to get me to talk about Jeffrey Epstein, Robert. No way. But
I'm not trying to talk about that specifically. I'm saying that law and order is very important to civilization. It is the foundation. If I give you $10 and you say, I'll pay you back Tuesday, and you don't, then I need to go to somebody and say, hey, you didn't pay me back, right? If you say, I'm going to build you a house and you don't, et cetera, et cetera. America has a foundation of law and order. Like the highest, lowest are all subject to law and order. And because I do stuff about dangerous places, I constantly travel to places where there is no law and order. I mean, literally there's chaos. And yes, you could argue that there is some sense of frontier law, but when you come back to America, it's like, yeah, you have to have this paperwork and you have to do this and you can't do that and blah, blah, blah. I just looking for confidence that we have not veered off of that path. We are not a country that is ignoring the importance of law and order. And as a lawyer, obviously, you would argue with me like, this is why I'm a lawyer. You're not, right? But can we rely on the legal system and law and order in America and feel comfortable that it still works?
It's an interesting question because people talk about the balance of power between the different branches of government.
Right.
But within the legal system, there's also a balance of power. And I really do believe that it works. I believe that it still works. And as long as the system is able to self-correct and perform sort of basic hygiene, I have full confidence in it. And what I mean by that is, we talked about some of the different roles of prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges. Mm-hmm. Each player in the system has a particular role in making sure that the other is doing its job and being honest. So the prosecutor, again, has that very important gatekeeping function. Mm-hmm. When they fail, there's a defense bar of aggressive, competent, ethical lawyers who make sure that they are being put to the test in each and every case. Mm-hmm. And I can't tell you how important that is. And that's not to say, that only matters when people are innocent. It's not about getting innocent people, setting innocent people free. Of course, that's important. And innocent people, when the system's working properly, are not prosecuted at all. But the point of having such an aggressive defense bar is making sure that the government is being put to its burden in each and every case. I mean, the prosecutor's job is difficult, and it's supposed to be. Then you have judges, which are supposed to sort of oversee this back and forth between the prosecution and defense, make sure that the law is being followed, make sure that the Constitution is being adhered to. And then ultimately, if it goes to a trial, you have jurors, citizens of the country who are going to make a determination about one of their own. Is this person guilty or innocent, or not guilty, or guilty or not guilty? Has the prosecution proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt? And I can't stress to you how high that burden is. You have to prove to 12 people who don't know each other, who have nothing in common, and have no idea about what the subject matter area is. You have to get them to agree unanimously on this issue beyond a reasonable doubt. It is a very, very high burden. It should be. And all of the different players in that process, I think, are just extremely important, making sure that it functions properly. And if one thing gets out of whack, the other players in the space are supposed to self-correct. And I think that does happen.
So that's a very good point. There's an internal tension just within the justice system.
Yes.
That regulates itself. And I don't think people realize that much, but we see it in courtroom dramas, don't we? The judge yelling at the lawyers and the lawyers yelling at the lawyers and the juries. But you're right, and that's a very healthy thing. So in closing, I want to hear about your favorite case. I want you to tell me about a time you were handed a case and they said, Artie, go do it. And how did it work out?
My favorite case. Wow. I think one of the cases, I'll give you two from sort of opposite sides of the spectrum. I think one of the cases that I'm most proud of is the second to last trial that I did, where we had worked for 6 years we had reopened the murder of Jam Master Jay, who was the DJ of the famous hip hop group Run DMC. He was killed in his music studio in Queens in 2002, and the case had been cold. We had picked it back up. We worked it very, very hard. We were able to figure out what happened, frankly, get some witnesses who were not predisposed to cooperating with law enforcement to work with us. And we were able to convict those two people and, to hug Jam Master Jay's family after that verdict came in, after working on that case for so long, and after, sort of 20 years and however many Netflix documentaries, knowing that that case was never going to be solved. That was a big moment for me. And, the other thing I would say is I really enjoyed working on the transnational terrorism cases. I think there's no way to tell whether or not we foiled a plot or an attack, but you have to feel like that matters when you neutralize people who appear to be going down the road to doing something very bad. I'll give you one example. There was a young woman in Long Island, educated, successful, had her own job, had become highly radicalized and wanted to make hijra to Syria and join the Islamic State. We ended up doing an investigation and charging her. But the thing that really shocked me, because we did a lot of those cases, you'd be surprised how many Americans wanted to go over there. And
tell me about it. I get these calls like, what do you call that when a drunk guy what do you call those? What do you call interventions, right?
Yeah, well,
I've actually been called by members of the CIA to do an intervention on a guy who wants to join Al Qaeda.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was way more of them than you think. But when the FBI arrested this particular person, we found in her room a night vision scope and the accurate license plates of all of the plainclothes surveillance cars that had been sort of circling her house over the last month. And you just, you think of about that and you wonder, when you see these like lone wolf attacks where they cost under $30 and all you need is a knife or a car or something like that. And you just wonder, like, did we get here just in time? You really don't know. And I'm very, very proud to have worked with, the FBI and a lot of other great agencies, both in the United States and abroad, on those types of cases.
Well, okay, we've been chatting for an hour. We could go on for another hour, but I wanted to thank you, Artie, because people might think, well, he's not a terrorist, he's not a journalist. I'll be, no, it's really important to understand, the quiet side of fighting for law and order. You don't get medals, you don't get written up in the paper, but yet it's part of the day-to-day grind that removes deadly people and solves murders and things like that. Plus, I just wanted to get a sense of where we as a country are going, because, like Russia, it slides back and forth between anarchy and sort of democracy for a few minutes and then back into autocracy. So we're in a sort of very volatile moment. And I think people lose faith in the physical structure. And you talking about the dynamics of the system, the court system, the prosecutors, the lawyers, or things like that, I think reassures people to understand that, it wasn't put together by stupid people, right? It works.
No,
and
it really wasn't. Yeah. And I think I look, America's resilient. I think the American people are generally much, much more intelligent than I think they're given credit for, myself included. And, having worked on both sides of the justice system, first as a prosecutor and now as a defense attorney, I have more faith than ever that the system will persevere and that it works.
Mm-hmm. All right, Artie, we'll leave it at that. And thank you for your time. And we will wish you all the best at Baker Hostetler.
Robert, it's great to see you. Always fun to talk to you. Glad we recorded it this time.